Merry Christmas, everybody. We're almost there. I say that because, in my house, I'm fortunate because my wife is a planner. So we're like set, and we've been set for a while. So some of you are probably more like me. Some people call us procrastinators. I just think we're seize the moment type of people. But if you're that kind of person, this is the moment, so seize it. So whatever you need to do it today, get ready, whatever you have to cook, bake, wrap, buy, get all that. Because Christmas is coming up really quick. Christmas is the celebration of the birth of Jesus. That's the heart of it. I know there's a whole bunch of other stuff that goes into it, but that's the heart of what Christmas is all about. That name, Christ Mass, comes from this. It was originally a Catholic Mass that would celebrate Jesus and the birth of Jesus. And one of the things we've been talking about as we've gone through this Christmas season is that Jesus and his story, and even his birth story that we picture at Christmas with, Jesus and the shepherds and the Magi and all of that, that story didn't come out of nowhere. It was part of a story that had been going on long before Jesus shows up. And the writers of the New Testament, when they write about Jesus and when they write about Jesus' birth, they want to make sure that we understand that, hey, this isn't just out of nowhere. God didn't just invent this. The Bible, if you're familiar with it, has two parts. The Old Testament is the first part. The New Testament is the second part. There's about 400 years between those, where there's at least in the biblical story, there's a lot that happens in terms of human history, but in the biblical story, there's not a lot that happens. And so sometimes we're tempted to see the first part of the story, the Old Testament, the story of Israel, that kind of failed. So God just wiped the slate clean and then started over. But the New Testament writers want us to know, no, that's not what happened. That Jesus shows up as a part of what had already been happening, as a part of what God has been up to. And so that's what we've kind of been looking at this Christmas is how does Jesus fit into this story of what God began to do in and through the nation of Israel? That God actually had a purpose. He had a mission long before Jesus showed up. And the Apostle Paul, who's a guy who writes a big chunk of the New Testament, the Apostle Paul actually tells us in one of his New Testament letters, he says, hey, here's what God was doing all this time. And Paul, the way Paul words it is interesting because Paul says, listen, really up until Jesus, what God was up to was kind of a mystery. Nobody really understood, but when Jesus showed up, Paul said, now we know. And here's how Paul describes that mystery, Ephesians 1, 9 through 10. Paul says, he, talking about God, he has made known to us the mystery of his will, according to his good pleasure, which he proposed in Christ to be put into effect when the times reach their fulfillment, to bring unity to all things in heaven and on earth. Paul says, here's the mystery. Here's what God has been up to. That if you look at really the entirety of the biblical story, we're going to kick off next year by looking at the first part of Genesis 1 to 11, a little bit of 12, but that's sometimes what's called prehistory. And really that story is, hey, here's how God created everything, but then it all kind of went bad. And really God's good creation is like unraveling. And so Paul says, here's the mystery of what God has been up to, is this good creation that's been unraveling, God has been working to bring it back together. That's what the whole Old Testament story is about. That's why God creates the nation of Israel. That's why God comes to this guy, Abram, and his wife, Sarah, who at the time God begins talking to them, they're this old barren couple. And God says, listen, I want you to follow me, and what I promise is that through you, I will make you the parents of a great nation. That nation will ultimately become Israel. And Israel is going to work with me on this mission. They're going to be my representatives, and they are going to be the means by which I am going to bring all of this stuff back together. And so that's why God creates the nation of Israel to partner with him in this mission of bringing this unraveling creation all back together again. And so when you look throughout the Old Testament, the nation of Israel will be called a lot of different things in terms of its relationship to God. There's a lot of different images, metaphors that are kind of used to explain, hey, this is Israel's relationship with God. This is how Israel partners with God. This is what it means for Israel to work with God. One of the names that's given to Israel is referred to as God's servant. Israel is the servant of God for the purpose of his mission of bringing all this stuff back together. Israel is supposed to really show the world, hey, this is what God is like, and Israel's supposed to invite the world back to God to be a part of his bringing all this stuff back together. And so Israel's referred to as the servant of God. Now, when you and I hear the word servant, probably what we think of is we think of hierarchical. that a servant serves someone, and so there is a boss or a master or leader, whatever the word is. And that is true. Like the word servant, even the way it's used in the Old Testament to talk about Israel, there is some hierarchy there. That God is above, and Israel then serves the purposes of its master, which is God. But in the Old Testament context, that word servant carries a lot more than just hierarchy. Because in that Old Testament culture, a servant was actually very much empowered by the master, that the servant was the official representative of the master. And the servant was actually given authority on behalf of the master. So the servant could conduct business on behalf of the master. The servant could engage in whatever social realities were there, and they were seen as the official representative of the master. They were endowed with the authority of the master to act on the master's behalf. And what the master was responsible for was to provide and protect for the servant. And so it's not just hierarchical, it speaks to that kind of relationship that Israel was meant to be as the servant. Israel was meant to be the representative of God, given his authority and his power to act and to show the world, hey, this is what God is like. Now, if you read the Old Testament story, what becomes pretty clear is that Israel always struggled to live up to its identity as the servant. And ultimately, there's these people that come along, they're known as prophets, spokespeople, people who speak on behalf of God. And a lot of the prophets become very critical of Israel and say, you failed to live up to your responsibility to be God's servant. And they'll say a lot of different things about Israel. They'll make a lot of accusations. But really, what the prophets are kind of judging and condemning Israel for is essentially two things. There's two things that they will be judged and they'll be condemned for. Go ahead and go to the next one. Yes. They're unfaithful and they're unjust. That's the two things the prophets keep saying. That unfaithfulness refers to their commitment to God. That Israel never fully stays loyal to God. They keep going after other idols. They keep worshiping other gods. And so you'll have some prophets, like Hosea is one, that will actually accuse Israel of committing adultery. Say, Israel, you've committed adultery against God because you've been unfaithful to God. You've walked away from your one true God, the God who created you. You've walked away from the God who saved you from slavery in Egypt, and you've been unfaithful to him. Now, the other big criticism they'll get is that their society as a whole is unjust. And what's interesting in Israel is these two things are tied together. That their unfaithfulness kind of leads to their having an unjust society. Though as Israel's story kind of develops, you see greed and you see violence and you see corruption. All of that kind of comes to define their society at different levels. And these two things aren't separate, they're intertwined. That the problem in Israel isn't a lack of religion, but really it's kind of a corrupt, meaningless religion. And this empty, meaningless religion has become intertwined with how we live and how we do business and how we engage with each other socially and who we talk to and who we don't talk to. And so you have this intermingling of like social realities and religious realities that are found in this like kind of empty, meaningless religion that has created this corrupt, unjust society. And so this is what the prophets keep it on. This is why you're failing. This is why you're not living up to being the true servant. Because as a people, you have become unfaithful to God and unjust to the world around you. And Israel's task was never to itself. Israel's task was never, hey, you just be good and who cares the world around you. When God first appeared to Abram and Sarah, he told them, listen, I'm going to be with you. I'm going to watch over you. I'm going to be your master. You're going to be my servant. I'm going to bless you so that, go back to the last one, Genesis 12, 1 through 3. I'm going to bless you so that all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Israel's purpose was always global. Yes, I'm going to bless you, but not that my blessing is not just for your own benefit, it's for the sake of the world. And then the prophets come along and they say, and this is what you failed to live up to. Because you've been unfaithful to God, you've gone after other idols, you've gone after other gods, you've placed other priorities ahead of God, and as a result, you've also become unjust. And so in 586 BCE, the Babylonian army marches into Jerusalem. They destroy the temple, they destroy the city, they exile all the people, And the once kind of great thriving kingdom of Israel is no more. And so the Babylonian captivity is a lot of times what it's called. Sometimes it's just called the exile. Sometimes it's called the Babylonian captivity because both of those things happen. The Babylonian captivity becomes this moment where, hey, the servant, Israel as the servant of God, their story kind of seems to just completely fall apart because where do we go from here? Now, there's a book in the Old Testament called Isaiah. And Isaiah is one of the prophets. Isaiah, his actually career as a prophet is between the years, like right around the year 740 to right around 701, 700. That's when his career as a prophet, that's when he's speaking, that's when he's talking, which is he's like 150 years before the Babylonian exile. But when you get to the latter part of Isaiah, specifically Isaiah 40 through 55, the background of Isaiah 40 through 55, what Isaiah is talking about at that point is he's talking about the Babylonian exile. Now, scholars you'll find scholars that go both ways. Some people think that it's Isaiah 150 years before that's looking ahead, like anticipating, kind of seeing, kind of almost predicting this is what's going to happen. There are other scholars actually that will argue that the latter part of Isaiah was written by someone else and then added on to the book of Isaiah. Either way, for our purposes, doesn't really matter because what everybody agrees upon is this is what this part of Isaiah is reflecting on. This part of Isaiah, whether it happens beforehand or happens afterwards, it's reflecting on this reality that because of Israel's failure to live up to its job as the servant, it is going to be conquered, it's going to be exiled. And so that part of Isaiah has this kind of dual nature of it's looking back on why Israel failed, and it's also looking ahead to where do we go from here? What do we do now? Again, in Paul's language, Israel was the means by which God was going to fulfill his plan to bring everything back together, but Israel has failed. What kind of happens now? And so within that part of Isaiah, specifically between Isaiah 42 and 52, there are these four famous passages. They call them the servant songs. And there are these four passages that talk about the nature of the servant of God and what it means to really be the servant of God. And what's interesting is in these four specific servant songs, who the servant is never fully identified. And so again, if you look at different scholars, they'll debate what is Isaiah really talking about? Because we talked about Israel is described as a servant of God, but Israel is not the only one described as a servant of God in the Old Testament. There are also individual people. That this prophet or this king may be the servant of God. Sometimes actually foreign nations, God will talk about they're my servant because they're doing what I need to happen in order for my plan to kind of go forward. And so there's a whole bunch of people that are talked about, but usually it's pretty clear, like God will say this is who the servant is, but these passages in Isaiah it never really defines, hey, here's who the servant is. One scholar in particular, his name is John Goldengay. What John Goldengay argues is he says, listen, these servant songs in Isaiah, what these essentially are is their job descriptions. These are job descriptions of what the ideal servant of God actually should look like. This is really what it means to be the servant of God. And so what I want us to do real quick is I want us to look at a couple of these songs and see what is the actual job description of the servant. What does it really mean to be the servant of God? And then we'll come back real quick and ask at the end, and who exactly is this part of Isaiah talking about? Who actually is this servant? And so we'll look at the first one, which is Isaiah 42, 1 through 4. And again, this is just the prophet kind of saying, hey, here's what it really means to be the servant. First one, here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit, my presence on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or cry out, or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice on the earth. In his teaching the islands will put their hope. And so the emphasis of this first song is the idea of justice, which again is one of the primary ways in which Israel failed. And justice is about making things right. It's about right living. It's about right action. It's about doing the right things, particularly in the context of relationships with other people. How do I act justly toward you? How do I act justly toward the world around me? And so at the heart of what it means to be the servant is, listen, the servant is one who will bring forth justice, who will do what is right, who will do what is right in their own personal relationships, who will do what is right in terms of the way they engage in society, who will do what is right for marginalized and oppressed people groups. That's the heart of what it means to be the servant. The servant brings justice onto the earth. But what's equally important in this is not just what the servant does, it is the way the servant does it. This servant, Isaiah says that they will, a bruised reed they won't break, a smoldering fire they won't put out. That if there's people who are bruised, if there's people who are broken, the servant is not harsh. The servant is not mean. The servant is not critical. The servant will care for and bind these wounded. When they're about to flame out, the servant will help to reignite them, to bring life, to bring healing, to bring joy. So when Isaiah talks about the servant is really about two things. The servant is about purpose and posture. It's both of those things. You can put those up so you can see. It's about purpose and posture. The servant has a purpose. You will bring justice, and specifically God's justice, God's brand, God's form of justice. You will bring God's justice, but you will also do it in this way that is rooted in kindness and compassion and in love. The servant of God is defined by both, not one or the other. So if you're fulfilling the purpose, but you're being a jerk about it, you're not living up to the job description of this is not what it means to be the servant. And likewise, you can be really nice, but if you're not kind of working toward the justice aspect, then you're not living up to what it really means to be the servant. The servant is about both purpose and posture. Now, this is the first servant song in Isaiah, and I told you in the beginning there's four. The middle two, we're going to kind of skip over the middle two, not because they're not important, just we don't have time to go through all of them, but the second song, which is Isaiah 49, 1 through 6, really kind of talks about Israel, bringing Israel back. Being Israel as a servant, bringing Israel back. The third song, which is Isaiah 50, 40 through 11, is really about mistreatment and victory. But then when you get to the last song, this is the longest song, and it gives the most detail. This one is Isaiah 52 and in Isaiah 53. So we're going to pick up in Isaiah 53, verse 2. This is now the fourth servant song. Isaiah is talking about the servant. He says, he grew up before him like a tender shoot and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. This is how this servant is described. This is how the servant is talking about, that there's nothing flashy about the servant. There's nothing that you look at that automatically draws you that says, man, I want to be like this servant. I want to be with this servant. There is no reason, well, Isaiah tells us, there's no reason to desire the servant because the servant is despised and rejected. And what they're familiar with, what is their friend, what is their companion, is pain and suffering. And then what might be most troubling is the servant of God. Remember, this is, Golden Gate says, this is the description of what it means to be the servant of God. The servant of God is not thought well of. I was reading through these servant songs, and this one in particular, and I was in my office, and I was kind of reading through them, and I was reflecting on, what does Isaiah actually say here? And I started thinking back about, my own life and kind of my own journey. And I looked, and hanging on the wall in my office is my ordination certificate. An ordination, if you're not familiar with it, that's the process by which you officially become a pastor. And different churches, different denominations have different processes for ordination, but mine, I got a degree in church ministry, and I went before the elders of my home church, and they kind of interviewed me and did all this, and then there was a ceremony where they laid hands on me, and they prayed for me and officially ordained me. I was ordained 21 years ago. So I've been an ordained pastor for 21 years. And even the 4 years before that, I was in college studying, getting a degree in ministry, and I worked at churches all through that time. So pretty much I have worked at churches in the field, the vocation that we know as ministry for 25 years, quarter of a century. And I've gone to church my whole life, but for 25 years, I've worked at churches, I've been in ministry. So in addition to just all of that kind of experience, Like, I have 4 college degrees. Actually, no, I have 3 college degrees. I'm working on the 4th one. I'm not there yet, so don't give me credit yet. So I have 3 college degrees, all in ministry. I'm working on a 4th one. I have read countless books on ministry. Some of them are like biblical, theological. Some of them are leadership, skills. Some of them are, personal soul care, things like that. I've gone to conferences. I've gone to seminars. And I say all this because what just caused me to just literally sit in my chair for like 10 or 15 minutes was in all of my 25 years, in all of my training, my education, my formation, none of it is anywhere close to what Isaiah describes as what it means to be the servant of God. In fact, I was pretty much formed, and the example I was given was to be the polar opposite of what Isaiah describes. Because it's, you're always taught like, well, don't be flashy as a minister. But the reality is, in the culture that we live in today, you know who gets the invitation to speak at conferences? The flashy pastors. The ones that are dressed good and look good and have really slick Instagrams and all that kind of stuff. Like that's what gets rewarded. So even though that might not be officially part of the curriculum, like I don't think you're gonna go anywhere and someone's gonna say, as a pastor, you should be flashy. But that's what gets rewarded. And what gets rewarded, I've heard Andy Stanley say this, what gets rewarded is what gets repeated. And so all throughout my training, it's like, listen, you want to be a well thought of member of your community. Whatever community, you're the pastor, you want people to think well of you. You want to be respected. So make sure you dress in a way that is like, that people will respect and that people will like you and people will be drawn to you. And so I'm looking back over like all my experience and all my education and all my formation, and then I'm reading what Isaiah says, and I'm like, one of these things is not like the other. These 2 things are almost like the polar opposite. And then even when I think about like when I went into ministry, like what people tell you is like, listen, you're gonna be working for God. And it's gonna be so fulfilling and it's gonna be so great and you're gonna be so happy. Looking at Isaiah, who's like, the servant of God is one who is familiar with suffering and pain. That is their companion. And I'm like, so I'm reading through this and I'm reflecting back on my own life. And I start to think to myself, I'm like, I think I was lied to. Like I really think, and I don't think anyone was like bad, I don't think anyone was saying, but it's just like, I don't think we realize sometimes how much our faith, or even not so much our faith, but our view of church or of scripture or of God is shaped really by the world in which we live. Like you go back, I made that reference earlier that in Israel, part of what made Israel so like convoluted was you had this intermixing of, kind of this empty religion and then the social realities in which they lived. And American Christianity is very much shaped by Americanism that is not so much like rooted in Jesus or the New Testament or the Bible or anything like that. And so we have all these ideas of how we're formed and shaped and who we should be. And sometimes I think we find ourselves in this place where like, hey, what I signed up for is not what I got. And I'm sure at some point in your life, you felt that about something. At some point in your life, you felt like, hey, I signed up for one thing and what I got was not that. And I'm sure that there's some of us, other than just me, that feel that way when it comes to faith. That I came to faith, I came to church, I came to Jesus because I wanted whatever, healing or purpose or significance or, I want to, but I feel like what I've gotten isn't what I signed up for. And that's a little bit how I felt, even just as I read through this on my own. Because if what Isaiah is saying, and if Golden Gate is right, which I think he is, if this is literally an ideal description of this is what it means and this is what it looks like to be the servant of God, then probably a lot of us were lied to. Because we view it as, I'm God's servant. That's about privilege. It's about status. And Isaiah's like, yeah, well, what do you mean by privilege? How do you define privilege? See, one of the reasons Israel failed is because their idea of the servant of God was rooted in privilege. And so Isaiah is saying, yeah, but it's very, very different. See, according to Isaiah, being the servant of God is probably not what we think it is. And if you think it's bad so far, it gets worse. Because here's how Isaiah goes on. 53, 4-9. All right, if you skip ahead. Talking about the servant, Isaiah says, surely he, the servant, took our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and a sheep before its shearers is silent. So he did not open his mouth. For the transgression of my people, he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. So Isaiah says it's not just that he was like not thought well of or kind of despised or familiar with pain and suffering. Literally, the servant is innocent. Servant does nothing wrong. The servant is completely innocent, yet the servant suffers as one who is guilty. You get all this language of a sheep before its slaughter and all these things. But the one phrase in there that sticks out to me more than any others is Isaiah says, when you look at the servant of God, the assumption that you will make is that they are cursed and punished by God. That's the assumption. When you see the life of the servant, you're going to think to yourself, man, what did that person do wrong? What did those people do wrong that they have brought upon themselves the wrath of God? There's a kind of a form of Christianity. You may or may not be familiar with this term, but there's this form of Christianity, this idea that's sometimes it's known as the prosperity gospel. And the idea behind it, sometimes the words that go with it are health and wealth. That hey, if you do all the right things, then God will bless you and you will prosper. And so if you do all the things that God wants you to do, the result will be material success and health success. Again, you may have heard that before. Really what it is it's in a lot of ways the same idea, but a reaction to what's known as retributive theology, which is the same idea, but it's the polar opposite. Retributive theology is if bad things are happening to you, it's because you did something bad. So if you are going through really bad health crisis or financial crisis, it's, well, you obviously did something bad. You need to make that right. And once you make that right, then God will bless you. And one of the things I don't think we understand is I don't think we understand like how influential those ideas are within American Christianity. They have shaped a large part of American Christianity. Some people would even say, well, aren't those biblical ideas? In Galatians 6, the Apostle Paul talks about this idea of reaping what you sow. That's what Paul says. Paul says you reap what you sow. What you put out there is what you get. And a lot of people say, well, see, that's that whole idea, that what you put out there is what you get. But what's important is in Galatians 6, when Paul talks about that, he talks about it as a principle, not as a doctrine. And what's important is essentially what Paul's saying is he goes, listen, generally this is kind of a true idea in the sense of if I'm nice to people, people tend to be nice to me. If I'm mean to people, people tend to be mean to me. That's what Paul's getting at. That's what Paul's saying, that if you're willing to help other people in times of crisis, more than likely, they're going to be willing to help you in times of crisis. But if you shut people off, this is the idea that Paul's getting at. That as a general idea, this is really true in a lot of areas in life. That what you give to other people is what you get. But Paul is not saying, hey, this is a fact that is absolutely true. See, when we talk about like prosperity gospel, retributive theology, really the word we use, those are fancy theological terms. The term that we use is karma. The karma is you get what you give. And that is a common idea, really not just in American culture, but it has in a lot of ways infiltrated into kind of like church and Christian theology. The problem with it is we've all seen instances where that's not the case. We've seen evil people succeed. We've seen evil people prosper. And on the flip side of that, we have seen good people suffer. And when you see those things, that's what creates a crisis in us. And the crisis really is, why did this happen to these people? Karma should have worked out for them. Prosperity gospel should have worked out for them. Retributive theology should have worked out for them. These people should have prospered because they were innocent, but they didn't. They suffered. These people should have gone down because they were evil, but they didn't. And it becomes this crisis because, again, deep within us, formed within even a lot of, again, I would argue American Christianity, is this idea of karma, that we should get what we give out there. Several years ago, I went with a team here from the church, and we went to India. And we were teaching at this like ministry leadership conference in India. And where we were in India, it's not illegal to be a Christian, but it is illegal to convert. You can't convert. And so these are people who are doing ministry in like a really tough part of the world, that they face a lot of resistance, a lot of pushback. And so we would get together in this kind of big room, and I don't know, there was maybe like 200 people that were in this, and they were working in all different kinds of ministries. Some were churches, church planters, some were working in clinics, special needs schools, all these different kinds of things. And so we'd get together and we'd talk and we'd go out and eat. We played some cricket, only time I've ever played cricket. That was fun. But one of the things, in fact, probably the thing I remember most from that trip to India is at one point they took me, and I was the only one, I think, from our team, and they sat me in this room with probably maybe 10 of these local village pastors. And they were all guys, and they were guys that were planting churches in these little remote villages out in India. And these guys, more than anyone else, were facing intense persecution. Like, I'm not talking about like a little resistance, I'm talking about persecution. They're like telling me these stories. These are guys who like, literally in their villages, people beat them up and throw rocks at them because they see them as a threat. And these are guys that literally, they have in their villages death threats against them. That people have said, if you don't shut up, if you don't stop this, I'm going to kill you. And they're like, Scott, we'd like you to come in and talk to these people about leadership and about church. And I remember sitting there, and I think I was the youngest guy in there, and I'm surrounded by all these guys, and I'm speechless, I'm overwhelmed, I'm like super emotional, trying to hold back tears, because here's what's crazy to me. In that room, pretty much everyone in the world, probably even these guys, would have looked, and I would have been the successful one. Because look, I live in a nice area. I live in Orange County. I'm the pastor of a pretty good sized church. I own a home, and my kids do well, and we have 2 cars, and we get to go on vacation, and everything. And I'm the successful one. So I remember these guys are looking at me, and whenever you talk to people, they always tell you like, oh, you got to build rapport, you got to relate with people. And I'm thinking, how do I relate with these people? You know what happens when people get mad at me? They go home and they either send me a nasty email or they post it on Facebook. Like, when people threaten me, you know what people threaten me with? Scott, I did not like your message. I disagree with you. I'm going to leave and go to another church. I'm sitting there like, when people don't like these guys' sermon, they throw rocks at them and kick the crap out of them. That's what they do. And when people threaten these guys, it's not like, I'm going to go to another church. I'm going to kill you. And in my mind, I'm sitting there thinking like, this is totally backwards. These guys are doing ministry, God's work, whatever you want to call it, church leadership and planting in an environment that I cannot even possibly imagine. And I was just like overwhelmed with gratitude and respect. And I thought, you all have way more to teach me than I have to teach you. But there's no one in the world that would have looked at that room and looked at these guys who were planting churches in these remote villages that, I don't know, maybe 5 people went to their church. And they got death threats and they got beat up. No one would have looked at them and said, you're successful. No one would have looked at them and said, you're blessed by God. I only know one person who ever said anything like that. Jesus. Jesus said, blessed are you when people persecute you and mistreat you because of me. I think Jesus is the only person that would have looked at that room and said, Scott, you're the least successful person in here. Because no offense, people threatening to leave to another church and people talking bad about you on Facebook is nowhere near what these guys are doing. And see, this is what Isaiah is getting at. Our definition of success, the way that we kind of define success and blessing, that's not going to be present in the servant. It's completely different. It's upside down. Sometimes you're going to suffer. Now, what Isaiah is going to make clear, and what Isaiah does make clear, is it's not that the servant loses. the servant is victorious. The servant may not be successful in the way that we tend to define success because we have a very Western Americanized view of success, not like a Jesus-centered, gospel-centered view of success. But the servant will be victorious, which is ultimately where Isaiah brings this as this song ends. Isaiah 53, verse 10 through 12. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush them and cause them to suffer. After he suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied by his knowledge. My righteous servant will justify many. Therefore, I will give them a portion among the great. So yes, the servant will suffer. The servant will be persecuted. All these super fun things we've talked about that I know you're really glad you came to church today, especially during the Christmas season. But ultimately, that leads to victory. Because on the other side of suffering and death, there is life, there is resurrection. There is a portion with the great. So ultimately, there's victory. And again, if you go back to what Isaiah said, the previous passage we read, that victory is not just for the servant, but for a whole bunch of other people. Because what the servant does, what the servant goes through, what the servant endures, and the victory the servant gets is not just for the servant, but for the benefit of many others. That the servant isn't just about the servant does that, endures through all that, and comes out the other side to the benefit of others. Which again, when you go back to Israel, what was Israel's purpose? That all nations on earth will be blessed through you. And see, this is where Israel never really lives up to the job description of the servant. Israel kind of gets the whole thing backwards. And so when you get to Isaiah, the latter part of Isaiah, and the prophet is looking back on why Israel failed and also looking to the future of where do we go from here? Now that Israel, the servant of God, now that Israel failed, where do we go from here? And see, what happens is you get to the end of Israel's story, as you get to the end of the Old Testament, there begins to be this hope that emerges within the remnant of Israel. And this hope is built around this idea of the Messiah. And Messiah is a Hebrew word that means anointed one. The Greek translation of Messiah is Christ. They both mean the same thing. It's the anointed one. And the Messiah is the one that was going to come out of Israel, that was basically going to do everything that Israel couldn't do. The Messiah was going to restore the kingship. The Messiah was going to bring justice. The Messiah was actually going to bring the Spirit, the presence of God. It was going to come back to the people of God. The Messiah was going to bring new creation and new life. And so what happens when Jesus shows up and when he's born is Jesus and his early followers claim he is the Messiah. And one of the passages that they use kind of as proof, look, this is they go back to Isaiah's servant songs. That I believe it's Matthew. In Matthew 12, Matthew actually says that Jesus' healings actually fulfill the servant songs. And then in Acts 8, there's this famous story where Philip, one of the leaders of the early church, he is talking to this Ethiopian eunuch, and he shares about Jesus using and beginning with the servant songs. And so the servant songs become this way that this is how people begin to understand Jesus. And part of the reason that so many people struggled with Jesus is because he wasn't who they thought he should be. He wasn't this great victorious Messiah. He wasn't this great ruler. He wasn't this king the way that Old Testament were king. He was completely different. And the early followers of Jesus and Jesus himself say, exactly, because you've got it wrong. The servant, the Messiah, isn't what you think it is. Look at Isaiah. Isaiah tried to tell you this is what it really means to be the servant. And what I love about Jesus and his story and his life is that right from the very beginning of his life, Jesus makes it clear that he's the kind of Messiah Isaiah talked about. Here's this picture of the Nativity. I love this picture. Not just this picture in particular, but I just love the Nativity. Wherever you see it, if you see one in your house, or you have one in your front yard, it's this simple image. If you have this couple, nativities, we always make Mary and Joseph look old, but they were pretty young. You have this young couple, and you have these shepherds that are just kind of rowdy, and even though the wise men weren't there the night Jesus was born, they kind of make their pilgrimage, and it's in this area designed for animals. There's nothing about this image that screams power and glory and might. Everything about this image points back to Isaiah's servant songs. See, right from the very beginning, Jesus makes really clear, if you're after power and glory and fame and all of that, you're not going to find it in me. Because what it means to be the Messiah isn't all of that. What it means to be the Messiah is exactly what Isaiah describes. See, I think if you go back to Isaiah, I said earlier that Isaiah never really defines who the servant is. And I think the reason for that is because what Isaiah is doing is he's kind of reflecting backwards and forwards. And he's realizing this is what the servant should be. This is what Israel couldn't live up to. And this is hopefully who the Messiah will become. And so when Jesus shows up, what Jesus embodies in every way is Isaiah's picture of the suffering servant. That this is why, in 1 Corinthians, this is why Paul will say all the promises of God are yes in Jesus, because everything God promised to do in and through Israel as the servant, he accomplished in and through Jesus. That Jesus is the embodiment of the true servant. Jesus is the fulfillment of this picture of the true servant that is the means by which God is bringing everything back together through his death and through his resurrection. And so the early followers of Jesus used Isaiah's servant songs as a way to understand and talk about who Jesus was and what it meant to be the Messiah. And this is where it gets really important for you and I, for them, the servant songs aren't just, here's what it means to be the Messiah, but here's what it means to follow the Messiah. Because who you say that Jesus is has everything to do with what you think it means to follow Jesus. Because if your picture of Jesus is health and wealth, prosperity Jesus, and if your picture of Jesus is Jesus is going to give you what you deserve, so if you mess up, he's going to strike you down, then guess what? That's how you're going to live. But if your picture of Jesus is the picture Isaiah paints in his songs, see, for the early church, the suffering servant songs in Isaiah, they weren't just job descriptions for the Messiah, but they were job descriptions for people who follow the Messiah. See, how we view and understand Jesus has everything to do with what we think it means to follow Jesus. It always reminds me, I don't know if you ever saw the movie Talladega Nights. Yeah, apparently some of you have. At the end the beginning of Talladega Nights, they're all sitting around the dining room and they're praying and they're talking about which picture of Jesus they like the best. Everyone's going around, and you can watch it. They say, you probably just Google it on YouTube, but they're like, I like to picture my Jesus in a tuxedo because he likes to party, and I like to picture the little baby Jesus because this, and they're just sharing like, here's the way I like to picture Jesus. And it's kind of a ironically funny scene because in a lot of ways that's what we do. We get our picture of Jesus, like this is the Jesus I like best, because then this is what it looks like to follow that Jesus. And see, what Isaiah wants to make clear to us, and what the birth of Jesus emphasizes, is that this is who Jesus is. And this is what it means to follow Jesus. So here's I think, the challenge for you and I. In what ways has your view of Jesus been shaped by something counter to the servant? What images do you have of Jesus that are formed by something other than the way Jesus lived, the way Jesus was born, the way Jesus died, the way Jesus taught? By something other than the picture of the servant Isaiah paints. And my hope for us is that every time through this week as we head up into Christmas, every time you walk by and you see a nativity scene, that you'll be reminded of what this really says about who Jesus is, about his purpose, about his posture. And that you'll be challenged to think, what does it look like for me? What does it look like for us to follow this suffering servant, Messiah? Let me pray. Father, I thank you so much for your love for us. I thank you for everything that you have given to us, that you came down to earth and you emptied yourself of everything for our benefit. You suffered, you died, but ultimately you were victorious. You were victorious not because you escaped suffering and death, but because you endured it and you overcame it. And that is the means by which you are bringing everything back together, by which you are restoring creation and making all things new. And God, we are invited as a church to be your servant, to be the embodiment, the living embodiment of the Messiah on this earth. We'll never be exactly who Jesus is, and we're not meant to be. But we are meant as a church to be his servant, to live in the way that he lived, in the purpose and the posture that he lived in. And God, I pray that this Christmas season will just be a time for us to reflect. Every time we see that manger scene, every time we see that nativity scene, for us to really stop and think, who really is Jesus? Not who have I been told Jesus is, or not even who do I want Jesus to be, but who is Jesus? And what does it mean for me to follow Jesus as Messiah? God, we love you. Thank you. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.